I shut it off. That's the safe way to handle that keyboard. Today is the 10th day of the season of Lent, and Lent is the 40-day period leading up to Easter. Now, Sundays are not counted as part of 40 days. This year, Lent began on Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, February 17. And the Lenten season is used by Christians as a time for inner preparation for Easter, the Easter experience. And this year, Easter is on Sunday, April 4th. During this time of Lent, most choose to make some kind of sacrifice by giving up something, like giving up chocolate or eating meat on Fridays for Lent. The way that Unity suggests that we use this period of time and prepare for Easter is to choose to work on ourselves by releasing, by giving up, letting go, or fasting from some negative belief, attitude, or behavior, and instead affirming, grabbing hold of, or feasting on positive thoughts, attitudes, and helpful behaviors. This works very well with today's message on loving our neighbor, because for Lent, we may opt to give up some of our negative attitudes, judgments, and criticisms that we hold in consciousness about our neighbors. So this is the third part of a three-part series based on the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 22, verse 34 through 40, where he gives the commandment about love. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, and one of them, who was an expert in Jewish law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And remember, in a previous service I shared that the Jewish religious law held 613 laws, and the religious leaders strove to keep every single one of them, an almost impossible task. But Jesus replies right away what the greatest commandment in the law is. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This, he says, is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And all the law and the prophets hang on these two. This morning we're going to explore this second greatest commandment, loving our neighbor. Now, some of you know that I love t-shirt sayings, and I found this one the other day. It's a message from God which says, "Oh, just love everybody. I'll sort them out later." That certainly is our goal, to love everybody. And we can let God separate that later. Let's begin with taking a look at what a neighbor is. A neighbor can have several different connotations. A neighbor can be the person who lives immediately next to you or across the street from you. A neighbor could be a person who lives in your apartment building, whether they are next door to you or not. A neighbor could also be in a biblical sense, that of love thy neighbor, any person who comes into contact with us, which must be treated, or who must be treated with the same consideration that we treat ourselves or a member of our own family. Being neighborly means not just being civilized with the person who lives next door. Being neighborly could mean being kind to another human being who happens to live in your same town or fairly close to you. My screen has gone black. Sorry, we're having trouble playing this video. I'm going to keep going and hope that I don't get a call saying that you can't hear me or see me. I'm going to keep going, assuming that you do. Okay. Anyway, a neighbor can be someone who happens to live in our same town or fairly close to us within enough walking distance such that we and our neighbor can interact with one another without prior notice. But my take on who and what a neighbor is goes beyond this. A neighbor, to me, is someone whom we have regular contact or connection with. And this neighbor can be a relational neighbor rather than geographical neighbor. I think that a neighbor is someone who, in some way, enters our sphere of influence. So I think we can also consider those who go to our church or who belong to the same organizations that we do as be our neighbors. I also think that our neighbors can be people on the internet who are part of that chat or Facebook group, just like we are here at Unity Manhattan Live. Those we have befriended or those whose posts we follow can be our neighbors, even though they may live on the other side of the globe. As an example of a broader understanding of the word neighbor, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke, 10th chapter, verses 25 through 37. It's about a traveler who is robbed. He's stripped of clothing, he's beaten, and he's left half dead along the side of the road. And first, a Jewish priest comes and walks by him. And then a Levite comes by. And he crosses to the other side of the road and continues going by. Finally, a Samaritan, a person from Samarta, happens upon the traveler. Although Samaritans and Jews despised each other, the Samaritan stops and he helps the injured Jewish man. Jesus is described as telling the parable in response to the question from a lawyer who asked, "And who is my neighbor?" The conclusion is that the neighbor in the parable is the one who shows mercy to the injured fellow. That is, the Samaritan. So, a neighbor can be someone who is acting neighborly to us, providing us with assistance, support, or service of some kind. Someone who commits to helping us in some way. So, in a way, I think of all of you with us this morning in this online service as our neighbors. We are a community, an online neighborhood here in Unity where we live close to each other in our thoughts and in our hearts. I hope you know that I love you no matter where you live. So now let's explore how we can love our neighbors. Whether they actually live next door to us, or in our physical neighborhood, or in our relational or spiritual neighborhood, can we actually love our neighbors? Jesus evidently believed that we can because he made it a commandment for us to do. Each string is that the way that we are to love our neighbor is how we treat ourselves. As I have mentioned in a prior message, sometimes the easiest way that we get to help us get a better understanding of what something is to explore what it is not. So in this case, we can perhaps get a better understanding of how to love our neighbor by taking a look at the ways that we do not love our neighbor. Here's an example of how not to love your neighbor. Two men get out of their cars after they collide at an intersection. One man takes out a flask from his pocket and he holds it out to the other guy and says, "Here, maybe you'd like a sip to calm your nerves." "Thanks," replied the other driver, and he takes a long pull from the container. "Here, you have one too," he adds as he hands back the whiskey. "Nah," says the first man, "I'd rather not. At least, not until after the police have been here." How not to love your neighbor, okay? Personally, I think loving our neighbor is closely aligned with what is known as the Golden Rule. Now, there's a Baby Blues comic strip about modern life, modern family life that I enjoy reading in this line of journal. Wanda and Daryl spend much of their time chasing, refereeing, and coaching their 3 children. The eldest girl is Zoe, who appears to be about 9. Her younger brother, Hamish, or Hammy, is about 7. And then there's baby Wren, who is walking and making her own trouble for the family. The comic strip is written by Rick Kirkman and Jerry Scott. Now, in this particular strip, Mom, Wanda, comes into the kitchen where she sees Zoe very involved in some project on the kitchen table. Wanda asks her daughter, "What are you doing?" And Zoe responds nonchalantly, "I'm putting salt in Hammy's milk and juice." Mom says, "Hey, what about the golden rule?" Zoe responds, "I am following the golden rule. Do unto brothers before they do unto you." At this point, Wanda grabs her daughter's hand and pulls her off the chair and out of the kitchen, telling her, "Let's go read that again." The golden rule is an ethical principle of treating other people as we ourselves would prefer to be treated. The golden rule is not actually found in Scripture per se, but this became the popular way of referring to the words of Jesus in Matthew 7, verse 12, and in Luke 6, verse 31, when he teaches, "In everything, do to others what you would have them do unto you." The golden rule is a simple, yet it's a powerful way of saying that we should recognize and respect the dignity of our fellow human beings and not forget that we are all capable of mistakes, misdeeds, and of hurting others. In an article called "Feed the Right Wolf," Buddhist monk, teacher, and prolific writer Pema Chodron explains that we all have the potential to disentangle ourselves from old habits and the potential to love and care about each other. Chodron tells of a Native American grandfather who was speaking to his grandson about violence and cruelty in the world and how it comes about. He said, "It's as if two wolves are fighting in the human heart. One wolf is vengeful and angry, and the other wolf is understanding and kind." Now, the young man asks his grandfather, "Which would win the fight in the heart?" And the grandfather answered, "The one that wins will be the one that we choose to feed." So true. Children wrote in this article that in our relations with others, when we talk to someone we don't like and someone that we don't agree with, we tend to spend a lot of energy sending anger their way. Yet, our resentments and our self-centeredness, as familiar as they seem, are not our basic nature. All of us know how healing it is to be kind, how transformative it is to love, and what a relief it is to have old grudges drop away. With just a slight shift in our perspective, we can realize that people strike out and they say mean things for the same reasons that we do. With a sense of humor, we can also see that our sisters and brothers, our partners, our children, our boss, our co-workers are driving us crazy the same way that we drive other people crazy. Her suggestion to dealing with neighbors who do not express themselves in a neighborly way is for us to hit our interior pause button. Right in the midst of our challenges, Chodron writes, we can stop, we can breathe deeply and slow down and give space and empower the wolf of patience and courage instead of the wolf of aggression and violence. In that 3-second pause, she writes, we can interrupt what she calls the autopilot reactions. In this pause, we have time to reflect. Why do we want to make that nasty phone call or say that mean word? Pausing allows us to reconnect with the love that we have within us instantly in the moment of crisis and challenge. It may be hard to remember to pause at first, but as we continue to practice this, it becomes comfortable and habitual because it feels not to be all caught up in things. Just stop for a few seconds, breathe deeply, and then move on from a new place. In highly charged situations, or any time at all, we can shake up our ancient fear-based habits by simply pausing for a few minutes. I have enjoyed reading Marianne Williamson's book, Everyday Grace, Having Hope, Finding Forgiveness, and Making Miracles. In her book, Williamson shares some powerful insights on relating to others, especially when they seem difficult for us to deal with. Marianne confirms that it can be very hard to love people who are not showing love to us. But she writes, and we believe here in Unity, as love is every person's essential identity, regardless of how they act. People deserve love not because of what they do, but because of who they are. When someone has forgotten their love, they have fallen asleep as to who they are. Our mystical challenge, our spiritual power lies in choosing to remain awake. God's love in our hearts cannot be destroyed, but only temporarily put to sleep. When we're angry, Williamson says, we are simply hurting ourselves. Ask for a healing. Ask to experience our own angelic nature, so that we might see beyond someone else's behavior to the angel, however wounded, that's within them. Hate, writes Williamson, can summon the power of this world, but only love can summon the power of God. It takes tremendous faith in the power of love to refuse to hate those who behave in hateful ways. Yet, in that refusal lies our grace. When we realize that our mission is to love and forgive, we realize that every situation is an opportunity to do this very thing, to love and forgive. I love this. Williamson writes that every situation is a lesson in becoming who we are capable of being. Every situation is ultimately a lesson in forgiveness. Forgiveness is our decision to see the love that is real in all of us, despite whatever appears to the contrary. When we see beyond fear, it dissolves. Think about this when you're challenged by negative people, neighbors of any kind whom you find difficult to love. Williamson writes that everything should be interpreted as love or as a call for love. When someone has not shown us their love, our power is in knowing that they would if they only knew how. They are not wrong. They are not bad people. They are wounded, and our role is not to judge them, but to help them heal if we can. To close, I want to share a story that illustrates how to love our neighbor. This is a true story called The Cab Ride I'll Never Forget. It's written by Kent Nurburn about an experience that he had over 20 years ago, and it's in his own words. I drove a cab for a living. One time, I arrived in the middle of the night for a pickup at a building that was dark except for a single light in a ground floor window. Under these circumstances, many drivers would just honk once or twice, wait a minute, and then drive away. But I had seen too many impoverished people who depend on taxis as their only means of transportation. Unless a situation smells of danger, I always go to the door. The passenger might be someone who needs my assistance. So I walked to the door and I knocked. "Just a minute," answered a frail, elderly voice, and I could hear something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman in her 80s stood before me. She was wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat with a veil pinned on it, like somebody out of a 1940s movie. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag out to the car?" she said to me. So I took the suitcase to the curb and then returned to assist the woman. She took my arm and we walked slowly toward the curb. She kept thanking me for my kindness. "It's nothing," I told her. "I just try to treat my passengers the way I would want my mother to be treated." "Oh, you're such a good boy," she said. When we got in the cab, she gave me an address and then asked, could we drive through downtown? "It's not the shortest way," I answered quickly. Oh, I don't mind," she said. "I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to a hospice." I looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "The doctor says I don't have very long to live." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like me to take?" I asked. For the next 2 hours, we drove through the city. She showed me the building where she had once worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow in front of a particular building or a corner and would sit staring into the darkness, saying nothing. As the first hint of sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "I'm tired. Let's go now." We drove in silence to the address she had given me. It was a low building, like a small convalescent home, with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab as soon as we pulled up. They were solicitous and intent, watching her every move. They must have been expecting her. I opened the trunk and took the small suitcase to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her purse. "Nothing," I said. "Well, you have to make a living," she said. "There are other passengers," I told her. Almost without thinking, I bent and gave her a hug. She held on to me tightly. "You gave an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." I squeezed her hand, then walked into the dim morning light. Behind me, a door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought. For the rest of the day, I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten an angry driver, or one who was impatient to end his shift? What if I had refused to take the run, or had honked the cab once, and then just driven away? When I first heard this story, it brought me to tears, and it's bringing me to tears again. We can love our neighbors when we remember that the Christ in us loves the Christ in them. God bless you.